How long have you been seeing my sister?
There are moments in life that split everything in two. Before and after. The life you thought you were living, and the truth that was underneath it the whole time. And sometimes the most devastating part isn't what happened. It's who did it. Because when a stranger betrays you, you grieve them and you move on. But when it's your sister, the girl who shared your childhood bedroom, who borrowed your clothes, who stood beside you at your own wedding, something inside you doesn't just break. It changes. Permanently. Quietly. Into something even she never saw coming. This is that story. And before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Most people, when they lose everything, fall apart. They beg. They cry. They disappear into the version of themselves that the pain creates, and sometimes they never fully come back from it. But there are some people, the ones nobody ever sees coming, the ones who are always in the room but never quite in the frame, who go quiet. Who wait. Who build something so airtight, so complete, so carefully constructed that when the moment finally arrives, there is nothing left to say. No argument to make. No countermove to run. Just the slow, undeniable weight of everything they built while everyone else was looking somewhere else. She took everything from me. That's how Claire described it later, in the account she eventually shared. My husband. My family. My name. What she didn't know was that she'd been working for me the whole time. This is the story of a woman who was betrayed by the two people she trusted most in this world, and what she did about it without raising her voice once. Before we get into what happened, and we are going to get into all of it, you need to understand three things. Three questions that are going to sit with you through this entire story and that won't fully resolve until the very end. The first, how does a sister justify doing something like this? Not just the act itself, but the continuation of it. The dinners. The family gatherings. The ability to look across a table at the woman she wronged and feel, apparently, very little. The second question, why did two parents, people who raised both of these women, who watched them grow up in the same house, choose the wrong daughter? Not in a heated moment. Not in a single lapse of judgment. But consistently, over time, in ways that compounded. And the third question, the one that this story ultimately turns on, is how did the woman they all underestimated end up holding every single card? Because she did. Completely. Legally. Without ever once losing her composure. By the time this story ends, you'll have all three answers. But I'll tell you now, some of them are going to be uncomfortable. Because this isn't just a story about a marriage that ended badly or a family that fractured. It's a story about what happens when people spend years deciding who someone is, and then discover they were wrong about every single part of it. To understand what Claire did, you first have to understand who Claire was. And to understand who Claire was, you have to go back, not to the moment of betrayal, not to the meeting in the office, not to any of the dramatic turning points this story is full of, but to something much quieter than any of that. You have to go back to a house in the Midwest, sometime in the late 1980s, where two little girls grew up in adjacent bedrooms with a shared bathroom and a set of parents who worked hard and meant well and, without ever intending to, made a decision that would echo forward for 30 years. The decision wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a single moment. It was a pattern, the kind that families develop slowly, without noticing, the way a river carves a canyon not in a day but in 1,000 years of small, consistent pressure. The pattern was this: one daughter needed more. And so one daughter got more. And the other daughter, the one who didn't ask, who didn't demand, who figured out early that managing her own needs was simply more efficient than asking someone else to manage them, that daughter learned to be self-sufficient in a way that looked, from the outside, like she was fine. She was always fine. Claire was always. Her full name was Claire Elizabeth Mercer, and she was the oldest child by 4 years. 4 years is a significant gap in childhood. It means that by the time her sister Renee arrived, Claire was already a functioning little person with her own habits and preferences and interior world. She welcomed the baby the way oldest children often do, with a combination of genuine warmth and a pragmatic understanding that the household's attention had just reorganized itself. She adapted. She always adapted. That was the thing about Claire that people consistently underestimated, not her intelligence, not her capability, not her work ethic, all of which were evident to anyone who spent 5 minutes with her, but her adaptability. Her ability to take a situation as it was, rather than as she wished it were, and work within it. That skill, developed in childhood, would later become the foundation of a business. And then the foundation of something else entirely. By the time Claire was in high school, she had 2 jobs, one after school at a local copy shop, one on weekends helping a neighbor manage rental properties. She saved almost everything she earned. Not because she was anxious about money, but because having her own money meant having her own options, and Claire had understood from a young age that options were what separated people who had control over their lives from people who didn't. Renee Michelle Mercer arrived in the world the way some people arrive in rooms, loudly, demandingly, and with an immediate gravitational pull that reorganized everything around her. She was not a difficult child in the clinical sense. She wasn't cruel or troubled or particularly misbehaved. She was simply the kind of child who required a great deal of emotional energy from the adults around her, and who, when she received it, rewarded them with a warmth and affection that felt like sunshine. Their mother, Barbara, responded to Renee the way a lot of mothers respond to children who need them actively and visibly. She leaned in. She engaged. She was present in the way that Renee's emotional landscape demanded, and she felt needed in a way that Claire's quiet self-sufficiency never quite gave her. Their father, Donald, loved both daughters but spoke the language of the one who talked more, and Renee always talked more. This is not an indictment of Barbara and Donald Mercer. They were decent people doing their best with what they understood. But what they didn't understand, what they never fully grasped, was that Claire was paying attention to all of it. Filing it away. Drawing conclusions not with bitterness, not with resentment, but with the calm analytical clarity that would later make her very, very good at business. Renee's trajectory was different in almost every measurable way, and yet it worked for her, or appeared to, for a long time. She was the kind of student who got by on charm and last-minute effort, who somehow always landed on her feet, who collected friends and admirers and opportunities the way some people collect stamps. She attended the same state university as Claire, their parents couldn't have afforded otherwise, but she had a fundamentally different experience of it. Where Claire had been focused and quiet and purposeful, Renee was everywhere at once. She changed her major 3 times. She joined clubs and left them. She fell in and out of relationships with the kind of frequency that suggested she was someone who felt most alive when she was in motion. None of this was malicious. None of it was particularly self-aware, either. Renee was not, by nature, a reflective person. She lived forward, not backward, and she trusted, with a confidence that was almost childlike in its completeness, that things would work out. And because she was Renee, and because the world tends to cooperate with people who move through it without apologizing, things generally did work out. At least on the surface. At least for a while. The sisters maintained a functional relationship through their 20s. They were not close in the way that some adult siblings are close, the daily check-in calls, the best friend dynamic that some families manage to preserve across the transition to adulthood. But they were cordial. They showed up at holidays. They exchanged texts on birthdays. Claire, by her late 20s, was building her consulting firm, slowly, methodically, the way she did everything. She had started it out of her apartment with 2 clients and a laptop and the same disciplined reinvestment strategy she'd applied to every dollar she'd ever earned. By 32, she had a small team. By 35, she had a suite of offices and a client roster that included names she'd once have been nervous to cold call. She did not talk about this much at family gatherings. When her parents asked how work was going, she said it was going well. That was usually the extent of it. Renee talked about her jobs, a series of event planning and marketing positions, each more interesting sounding than the last, with considerably more enthusiasm and detail. Barbara and Donald listened to Renee and assumed Claire was doing okay. Claire was always doing okay. And then Claire met Marcus. Marcus James Whitfield was 34 when they met, at a professional conference in Chicago that Claire almost hadn't attended because she had a proposal due that Monday. He was warm and funny and paid attention in a way that felt genuine rather than performed. They were together within 3 months and engaged within 2 years. It was, by the accounting of everyone who knew them, a good match. Not a fairy tale. Claire didn't put much stock in fairy tales, but a real thing. A sturdy thing. The kind of relationship that two capable adults build when they actually choose each other with clear eyes. That, at least, was what Claire believed. She believed it for 6 years. The Tuesday it happened was not a remarkable day by any measure. Claire had been in back-to-back client calls from 7 in the morning until almost 4 in the afternoon, the kind of day that left her with a low-grade headache and the particular mental fatigue that comes not from hard thinking but from sustained performance, from being articulate and confident and reassuring for 8 straight hours on behalf of other people's problems. She came home to a quiet house. Marcus's car was in the driveway, which surprised her slightly because he had mentioned a late meeting. She remembers, in the account she later shared, noticing that the house smelled like he'd cooked something earlier in the day and then left it sitting. She put her bag down. She went to the kitchen for a glass of water. And on the kitchen counter, face up and unlocked, was Marcus's tablet, with a message thread already open on the screen. She was not looking for anything. She was reaching past it for the cabinet handle. She saw 4 lines before she had made any conscious decision to read them at all. She has never shared publicly what those 4 lines said. She has only said that they were enough, that 4 lines was a sufficient quantity of information to understand completely and permanently what had been happening in the margins of her life. She put the tablet back down, face up, exactly as she found it. She poured her glass of water. She went upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed, and stayed there for approximately 20 minutes without moving. She was not crying. She was not in shock in the dramatic, dissociative sense. She was doing what Claire had always done with difficult information, she was processing it. Organizing it. Placing it accurately within the larger architecture of everything she already knew and everything she now had to accept. When Marcus came home 40 minutes later, she was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea, already made, already cooling slightly. She had made him one without deciding to. The muscle memory of a 6-year marriage. He sat down. She said, simply and without preamble, "I saw the messages." And the conversation that followed was the kind that leaves marks on people that no subsequent therapy or time or goodwill fully erases. Marcus did not deny it. That much, Claire has said, she respected, or at least found less insulting than the alternative would have been. He confirmed that it had been going on for 7 months. He said he was sorry in the way that people say they are sorry when they mean it but also understand that sorry is structurally insufficient for the situation. And then he said the thing that stayed with Claire longer than any other part of that conversation. He said, "I think I've been unhappy for a long time and I didn't know how to tell you." Claire sat with that sentence for a moment. Then she asked one question. She asked, of all the people in the world, why her? And Marcus looked at the table, and he didn't answer directly, and the not answering directly was itself an answer. She told her parents 5 days later. Not immediately, not in a heat of grief, but after she had slept on it enough times to be able to speak about it without her voice shaking, because Claire was not going to call her mother with a shaking voice. She drove to their house on a Saturday morning. She sat at the kitchen table where she had sat 1,000 times before. She told them, clearly and without embellishment, what had happened. She told them who was involved. She watched her parents' faces as the information landed. And then she waited. Because what a parent says in the first 60 seconds after hearing something like this tells you almost everything you need to know about what the next chapter of your relationship with them is going to look like. Her father said nothing for a long moment. Her mother looked at the table. And then Barbara Mercer said the words that Claire has described as the second most significant moment of that entire period, second only to what came much later in an office conference room. Barbara said, "Well, Renee says it wasn't planned. That it just happened." 5 words into her response to her older daughter's marriage ending, Barbara Mercer had said Renee's name in a way that functioned as a defense. It just happened. As if the 7 months of messages, the accumulated deliberate choices, the sustained deception, as if all of that was simply weather. Something that occurred to people rather than something people did. Donald Mercer said he didn't want to take sides. He said these things were complicated. Claire sat at that kitchen table for another few minutes. She said okay. And she drove home. The divorce process began 6 weeks later. It was not contentious in the legal sense. Marcus did not want a fight and Claire did not want one either, for reasons that had nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with strategy. She had a business to run. She had clients who depended on her. She had a financial structure that needed to remain clean and undisturbed, and a messy, emotionally combustible legal process was not compatible with any of that. They divided what needed to be divided. They signed what needed to be signed. The attorneys were efficient. The process took 8 months and generated very little drama, which frustrated people in Claire's periphery who expected her to be angrier, louder, more visibly destroyed. She was none of those things. She went to work. She answered emails. She made decisions about her business with the same focused attention she had always brought to it. And she watched, from a careful distance, as Renee and Marcus moved from a secret into something visible, dinners, social media, eventually meeting the parents as a couple, at a gathering that Claire was not invited to and would not have attended regardless. What nobody around Claire understood during this period was that she was not suppressing her feelings. She was genuinely, methodically doing what she had always done with difficult circumstances. She was assessing the actual landscape of her situation rather than the emotional landscape of it. The actual landscape was what was going to determine what happened next. Here is what Barbara and Donald Mercer understood about their financial situation in the years following Claire's divorce. They understood that they received a monthly deposit into their joint checking account, a modest but reliable amount that supplemented Donald's pension and Barbara's part-time income from a local library where she still worked 2 days a week. They understood that their health insurance was handled, that they were covered under a plan they had never had to shop for or manage or worry about, which at their ages and with Donald's history of high blood pressure and Barbara's managed diabetes, was not a small thing. They understood that there was a small ownership stake, a few percentage points, in a family LLC that Claire had established years earlier, and that this stake generated occasional distributions and looked, on paper, like a kind of inheritance in advance that their successful daughter had structured for them as a gesture of family support. They were grateful for it in the abstract way that people are grateful for things they don't fully understand. They didn't ask questions. Claire handled it. Claire always handled things. Here is what Barbara and Donald Mercer did not understand about their financial situation. The LLC they held a minority stake in was a subsidiary entity, a wholly owned subsidiary of Claire Elizabeth Mercer's consulting firm, Mercer Strategic Partners. Their ownership stake carried no voting rights and no decision-making authority of any kind. The health insurance plan they relied on was a group plan administered through Mercer Strategic Partners' corporate benefit structure, meaning that their continued coverage was contingent on their continued inclusion in that structure, which was contingent on Claire's ongoing decisions about how that structure was organized. The monthly income deposit came from a management fee arrangement between the family LLC and the parent company, again, Mercer Strategic Partners, which Claire controlled in its entirety. What this meant, in the plainest possible language, was that the financial floor beneath Barbara and Donald Mercer, the thing that allowed them to live with a degree of comfort and security in their retirement years, was Claire's floor. Built by Claire. Maintained by Claire. Subject, in every legally relevant sense, to Claire's decisions. She had not built this structure as a trap. That is important to understand, and Claire has been clear about it in the account she shared. She built it the way she built everything, practically, efficiently, with proper legal guidance and a clear-eyed assessment of what made sense. Her attorney at the time had recommended the LLC structure as a tax-efficient way to provide ongoing support to aging parents while maintaining clean corporate separation. It was standard estate planning logic for a business owner in her position. It just happened to mean that, in the most technical and binding sense possible, her parents worked for her. Renee, for her part, had no idea. Why would she? In her version of the family, Claire was the responsible one who handled things. Renee didn't ask questions about things that didn't affect her. The health insurance plan they relied on was a group plan administered through Mercer Strategic Partners' corporate benefit structure, meaning that their continued coverage was contingent on their continued inclusion in that structure, which was contingent on Claire's ongoing decisions about how that structure was organized. The monthly income deposit came from a management fee arrangement between the family LLC and the parent company, again, Mercer Strategic Partners, which Claire controlled in its entirety. What this meant, in the plainest possible language, was that the financial floor beneath Barbara and Donald Mercer, the thing that allowed them to live with a degree of comfort and security in their retirement years, was Claire's floor. Built by Claire. Maintained by Claire. Subject, in every legally relevant sense, to Claire's decisions. She had not built this structure as a trap. That is important to understand, and Claire has been clear about it in the account she shared. She built it the way she built everything, practically, efficiently, with proper legal guidance and a clear-eyed assessment of what made sense. Her attorney at the time had recommended the LLC structure as a tax-efficient way to provide ongoing support to aging parents while maintaining clean corporate separation. It was standard estate planning logic for a business owner in her position. It just happened to mean that, in the most technical and binding sense possible, her parents worked for her. Renee, for her part, had no idea. Why would she? In her version of the family, Claire was the responsible one who handled things. Renee didn't ask questions about things that didn't affect her. Over the following 60 days, Claire did 3 things. First, she completed the formal restructuring of her parents' arrangement, transitioning it from an indefinite ongoing benefit to a 12-month wind-down plan, fully documented, legally compliant, with 60 days written notice as required by the agreement they'd all signed years before. The notice was delivered by certified mail, accompanied by a cover letter that explained, in plain and respectful language, that the arrangement would transition to a 12-month wind-down effective upon receipt, and that Claire's office was available to provide any documentation or reference support that might assist them in identifying alternative arrangements. It was not a threat letter. It was not an emotional letter. It read the way Claire spoke in professional contexts, clearly, completely, and without a word that didn't need to be there. Second, she initiated, through the appropriate corporate channels and with full documentation, a formal portfolio review of the holdings group subsidiary relationships, including the events management company where Renee was employed. This was a standard process. It was not fabricated as a pretext. But it was timed deliberately, and Claire knew exactly what it would surface and when. Third, she sent a calendar invitation to her parents and to Renee for a meeting at her office. Not their house. Not a restaurant. Her office. The invitation said, important conversation regarding financial and business matters. All 3 confirmed within 24 hours. The morning of the meeting, Claire arrived at her office an hour before anyone else. She made coffee. She reviewed the folders she had prepared, one for each of the 3 people who would be sitting across from her. Each folder contained the same core documents, the original LLC establishment paperwork, the dependency disclosure her parents had signed, the wind-down notice, and a 1-page summary prepared by her attorney that translated the legal language into plain English. Renee's folder contained one additional document, a copy of the acquisition paperwork for her employer's parent company, with the relationship to Mercer Strategic Partners clearly marked. Claire placed the folders on the conference table. She sat down. She waited. She has described this waiting period as one of the calmest 20 minutes of her adult life, which might sound strange given what was about to happen. But Claire had been building toward this moment for a long time, not with malice, not with anticipation of victory, but with the quiet and steady energy of someone who has been carrying a truth alone and is finally, at last, about to set it down in the room where it belongs. Barbara and Donald arrived together, as she had expected. They looked mildly apprehensive in the way that people look when they've been summoned to a professional setting by a family member, uncertain of the register, unsure whether to be worried. Donald was wearing the blazer he wore to church and to anything he considered serious. Renee arrived 6 minutes later, which was 4 minutes late, wearing the particular expression of someone who had told a friend that morning she figured Claire was probably going to make things weird again. She stopped slightly when she walked in and saw the folders on the table and the particular way Claire was sitting, not tense, not aggressive, but still in the way of someone who is entirely at home in the room she is occupying. Renee sat down. Claire said, "Thank you all for coming. I have some things I want to share with you directly, and I think it will be clearest if you read these first." And she slid a folder across the table to each of them. What followed was approximately 4 minutes of silence broken only by the sound of paper turning. Donald read slowly, his finger moving slightly along the lines the way he read anything he considered official. Barbara got to the dependency disclosure, the document with her own signature on it, and her hand stopped moving. Renee moved through her folder faster than the others, and she got to the acquisition paperwork last, and she went very still when she found her employer's name in the document with Claire's firm's name next to it. She looked up. Her expression was not the expression of someone who has been caught doing something wrong, it was something more disorienting than that. It was the expression of someone who has just discovered that the map they have been using to navigate a territory is not the map of the territory they are actually in. Claire watched all three of them. She did not speak until she was certain they had all read what needed to be read. Then she said, "I want to walk you through what each of these means." She spoke for 12 minutes. She explained the LLC structure, what it meant, what it didn't mean, what her parents' actual position within it was and had always been. She explained the wind-down notice, the timeline, what they could expect, and the resources her office could provide to assist them in the transition. She explained the corporate relationship between her firm and Renee's employer, and she explained that the portfolio review was ongoing and that outcomes would be communicated through standard professional channels. She told them she was not there to discuss the marriage, or the affair, or the birthday toast, or any of the personal history that had preceded this meeting. And then she said the sentence that has been shared and repeated more than any other part of this story. She said, "I want to be clear that none of this is punishment. These are decisions I have a right to make and a reasonable basis for making. I wanted you to hear them from me." Then she folded her hands on the table and she waited. Barbara began to cry almost immediately, not dramatically, but in the quiet, helpless way of someone who has just understood something they cannot ununderstand. Donald asked if they could discuss it. Claire said, "Of course. But the documentation stands as filed." Renee said nothing for a long moment. And then she asked the only question she would ask in the entire meeting. She said, "How long have you known you could do this?" And Claire looked at her younger sister and said, "Since the beginning. I just never had a reason to think about it." Now here is where this story takes a turn that not everyone who hears it expects. Because the assumption, the natural, almost narrative instinctive assumption, is that what came next was destruction. That Claire, having finally revealed the full extent of her leverage, proceeded to use it in the most comprehensive way available to her. That her parents lost their income and their insurance. That Renee lost her job. That Marcus, somehow, felt consequences. That is what the structure of this story seems to be building toward. That is what feels, emotionally, like it would be earned. But that is not what happened. The wind-down notice was real. It was filed, it was legal, and it was not retracted. But over the 12 months of that transition period, Claire, quietly, without announcing it, without asking for credit or acknowledgement, worked through a third-party financial advisor to help her parents identify an alternative income structure that didn't run through her company. She did not tell them she was doing this. She did not present it as a gesture of forgiveness or reconciliation or anything else that would have required them to respond to it emotionally. Her attorney coordinated it as a professional referral, framed as a routine resource provided as part of the transition process. By the time the wind-down completed, her parents had a functional alternative in place. They were not financially ruined. The alternative arrangement was slightly less favorable than what Claire had provided, and that difference was real and they felt it. But they were okay. She had made sure they were okay without letting them know she had done so. The portfolio review of the events management company concluded without significant operational changes. Renee was not terminated. There were some restructuring recommendations in the report, things that affected budgets and reporting lines in ways that made Renee's work environment somewhat less comfortable than it had been, but she kept her position. She was not fired. She was not targeted. The review was real and its conclusions were based on actual business analysis, and where those conclusions had minor negative implications for Renee's day-to-day professional life, Claire did not intervene to protect her from them. But she did not manufacture consequences. She did not use the corporate relationship as a weapon in the way that someone with less discipline, or more anger, might have. Marcus heard about the meeting the same evening it happened, from Renee, who called him on her way home. Claire has no direct knowledge of that conversation. But through a mutual acquaintance who had stayed close to both Claire and Marcus through the divorce and remained in contact with both afterward, she eventually heard what Marcus's response had been. He had said, apparently without irony and with something that the mutual acquaintance described as genuine, "I always knew she was the smartest person in any room she walked into. I just forgot that included rooms I thought I was running." Claire heard this secondhand, months later. When they told her, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "That sounds about right." And changed the subject. The relationship between Claire and her parents did not fully recover. That is the honest answer, and this account does not pretend otherwise. Barbara and Donald Mercer had, at the most critical moment of their older daughter's adult life, chosen a posture of false neutrality that functioned in practice as a choice. That choice had consequences for the relationship, and those consequences were real and lasting. But the relationship did not end. About 8 months after the meeting, Donald called Claire and asked if she would have dinner with him. Just the two of them. She said yes. They went to a diner not far from the house where she grew up. They didn't talk about Marcus. They didn't talk about Renee. They talked about his 70th birthday, what he remembered from it, what he wished had gone differently, what it was like to turn 70 and feel like you understood less about your family than you had at 40. He didn't apologize directly. He was not, by nature, a man who apologized directly. But he talked around the edges of something, and Claire let him, and by the end of the dinner something between them had shifted back towards something real, incomplete and imperfect, but real. They have had dinner 3 more times since then. Barbara has called once. The call was short. It was a start. Claire has continued to run Mercer Strategic Partners. The firm has grown in the years since all of this happened. She has hired 15 additional people. She has expanded into 2 new service areas. She said, "I didn't do any of it to hurt them. I did it so they would finally have to see me. Not the version of me they decided on 20 years ago. Me. And the strange thing is, I think that's what I needed too."
Before we close this out, I want to sit with you in something for a moment. Because stories like this one, and there are more of them than you might think, shared in forums and comment sections and long posts that people write at 2 in the morning when they finally decide to put something into words, stories like this one have a way of staying with you. Not because they're unusual. But because they're not. Because most of us have been in a family that decided something about us that wasn't accurate. Most of us have loved people who took our steadiness for granted. Most of us have been in a room where someone else got the toast and the raised glasses and the warmth, and we sat there and managed it, because that was what we did. What makes Claire's story singular is not what was done to her. It's what she did next. Not in anger. Not in haste. But in the slow, methodical, completely clear-eyed way that she had been doing things her entire life, the same way that everyone around her had been too busy looking at Renee to notice. There is something worth naming about Marcus's role in this story, because it is easy to let him recede into the background against the more dramatic relationship between the 2 sisters. But Marcus made a choice. He made it knowingly, over 7 months, with the person who shared a childhood with his wife. And when it was discovered, his first instinct was to explain his own unhappiness, as if the explanation of his internal state was the relevant thing in that moment. Marcus was not a villain in the operatic sense. He was something more ordinary and more common, a man who made a selfish choice and then explained it as an emotional inevitability. The world is full of people like that.
And Renee. Renee is perhaps the most complicated figure in this story, and I say that not to excuse what she did but to be accurate about what she was. She was not a calculated predator who set out to systematically take her sister's life apart. She was someone who wanted something and took it without fully reckoning with the cost, to Claire, to the family, to any of the people in the radius of the damage. She was someone who had spent her entire life having people reorganize themselves around her needs, and who had never been required, by any of the people who loved her, to fully confront what that cost other people. The meeting in Claire's conference room was possibly the first time in Renee's adult life that someone had laid out, in documented and unarguable terms, the actual architecture of a situation she had been living inside without understanding. Whether that changed her, that is a question this story cannot answer. People change slowly if they change at all. So here is the question I want to leave you with, and I mean this genuinely, because the comments on stories like this one are where the most interesting thinking happens and I read them. If you were in Claire's position, if you had spent your whole life being the capable one, the self-sufficient one, the one everyone assumed was fine, and you discovered that you had the means to make the people who had underestimated you and betrayed you face the full reality of who you actually were, what would you do with that? Leave your answer in the comments. Tell me what you would have done. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the next story in this series is the one that made me sit with it for 3 days before I could figure out how to tell it. It involves a missing will, a family business, and a recording that one family member made 10 years before anyone knew they might need it. It is about what people say when they believe nobody is listening. And it will stay with you. I'll see you there.